can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
I cannot see you. I will just try to pull you so I can see you in a better way. Yeah, okay. So, first I would like to introduce you like the motivations you have behind this research. So we were really looking for the low levels of female political participation in developed countries in Brazil. So we have only 15% of House of Representatives, and the mayors, and 17% of cities without women in city council. So, and we also have 7% of cities without any woman in city council. So we really were looking how we have, why we have low levels of female political participation in Brazil, and also the higher level of femicides, homicides of women in the same country. So in Brazil, we have an official number of 1,500,000 women murdered in 2018, and approximately two-thirds of them are Black women. So a Black woman in Brazil have 3 times more chance to be murdered than a white woman. Like we also, it's important to say that Black women are the majority, but they are really represented or super represented in an unproportional way in levels of violence and mass incarceration, and underrepresented in political participation. So even if you look for the number of women in in political participation, you can really see that Black women are underrepresented. So just to summarize, like Black woman is underrepresented is in almost everything who could indicate health, like labor market, political participation, and income. So if you look for all this data, we'll see really the Black woman in the lower level of the society, but they are really highly represented when you look for data related to violence. So femicides, human or gender violence, incarcerations, and sexual assaults and other crimes related to that. And so when we start to do the research, we are really looking if you can, like we have hypotheses that maybe you can have relations about the high levels of femicides in some place and the levels of female political participation in other place. I'll just stop sharing. I'll come back very soon just because I wanted to look for you all. And we are really thinking about the relationships you can have about that. And we also have some hypotheses that maybe we can see a relation between Black femicide and gender inequality in political participation. And no, we are looking for counselors because you can capture more broadly than female mayors because the number is very small, very slow in Brazil. And as I said before, Black women are the biggest victims of violence and occupy less political space in Brazil. And looking for the results of special models we have, I think Matt can explain this better. We really saw two things. First, that municipalities, Brazilian municipalities with high rates of femicides among Black women in 2018 and 2019 tended to elect more Black women to councillors, but when considering the high volume of femicide of women in general, the trend is to decrease the number of elected councillors. And when considering not the volume of violence, but changes over time, the pattern is inverse. So in other words, where there is an increase in femicide against Black women between 2014, 2015, and 2018, 2019, and these both are these time frames are elections years in Brazil. So we are comparing two election years in Brazil. Fewer Black women were elected as councillors. So whereas where there was an increase in femicide in general during this period, more women were elected. So we are looking if the literature, like the previous literature, could help us to think about hypotheses that could dialogue with these results. So the first of all, I think first of all, we think the concept of femicide in his feminist formulation is really important to think about that. And we are using Diana Russell concept, like really think about femicide as the murder of women by men motivated by hate, contempt, pleasure, or a sense of ownership. And because you believe that this concept authorized us to think about the the belief that some men have, that they have the right of domination in relationships with women, both in the realm of intimacy and also in public social life, because you think this sense of entitlement, the right of domination, could also explain the political violence that we are also experiencing in Brazil, seeing how when we have more Black women elected in Brazil, you also are seeing high rates of violence and this sense of domination really authorizing public discourse against Black women, and sometimes even using lethal force, as we have the Marielle cases in Brazil. I mean, she was elected, she was a LGBT, a lesbian woman, actually bisexual woman, married, with really progressive work about women rights, about female emancipation, and we really saw how her discourse was disauthorized and how some men have this sense of domination against her, and this really had a sad result, like including the murder of the very murder of her. So we are really trying to understand the relationship between these both phenomena and to see if to see how we can identify the sense of the domination, and also not only to see the violence that Black women suffer, but also to see how they organize themselves to act against this violence, and the political representations could be a piece of that. So a piece of this response, this answer from Black women to the sense of domination and to, I mean, patriarchal violence against them, not only in the private space, but also in the public space. But I think, sorry, I forgot that I stopped sharing the the presentation. There was a second one. I'm really sorry for that. Really, with the points that I was trying to make right now, I'm really sorry that I forgot that. Also, I think the last thing I really want to talk is that we are really looking for intersectionality as a framework to understand this relationship between violence and political participations, because first of all, we really believe that looking for gender, class, and race, you can have a better result and be in a more complex analytical framework to look for situations. And in societies like Brazil, that we really have a diverse population, and where race and gender are really important to, I mean, can frame the experience of people have about empowerment and also disenfranchisement. I think it's really important to look for political participation, look for intersectionality, at least for gender and race. That is something that is really clear for us, and we have data for that. We don't have data for sexuality, because it's not, I mean, we have it, but we don't have this for femicides. So you cannot do the connection with the both data for the two phenomena. But we really believe that looking for race and gender together, we can have a better frame and really explain the bias against women, not in political roles, and also the violence against women in politics, together with the phenomenon of intimacy violence, so gender violence in sexual relations. But this is also, I think I'll pass. Marcelo, do you want me to still passing on the what do you prefer?
No, thank you, Aline. I can share my screen here.
Okay,
Thanks a
so
lot.
I'll just stop.
Okay. So before sharing my screen and following with the presentation, let me just step back for 1 second to share a little bit of the background of this research. Uh, we, as Aline mentioned, we are really interested in trying to understand the the possible relation between these struggle with violence against women and feminicides in Brazil. And we know that this is a reality in several developing countries. And also the challenge to increase women participation in politics, which is also very low in Brazil, as Aline mentioned. And we also know that this is also a reality in several developing countries. Uh, and we spent a lot of time until recently trying to figure out what could be the possible direction of this relationship. We investigated a lot if the female participation in politics would somehow influence violence and the other way around. And so just to share with you that this current results that we're about to present you are the most recent and most promising results that indicate a possible relationship between this level of violence and political participation. And we did not find the same relationship the other way around. So female political participation having any influence on violence against women. But I thought it would be important to share that with you so that you could understand here our methodology. So the choice of our variables here. We basically at this point have a lot of quantitative results. We have a lot of regressions, both using non-spatial and spatial methods and spatial diagnostics that will be presented by Matt. But we are basically investigating the variation in the percent of women elected and also candidates to each city council in Brazil between 2016 and 2020. So Brazil has these 5,500 municipalities. Each of them has a city council. And the two latest elections were in 2016 and 2020. We we have our identification strategy here based on the variation of the percent of women elected, and also more recently, Matt will also present you the preliminary results for candidates. Initially, we had only the results for the variation in women elected to city councils, but also we ran the results for candidates to these city councils. And the key independent variables here are two. First, it's the baseline level of violence in each municipality in 2018 and 2019. These are the two latest years in the mandate of the councilwoman and councilperson elected in 2016. So we chose to have an average of these 2 years so that we could maximize the effect of the having this councilwoman in these municipalities. So they would have a broader exposition in media and to society. So if there is any effect, that will be captured by the two latest years of this mandate and right before the election in 2020. And so this, we would call it the level of violence in each municipality, the average of feminicides in 2018 and 2019. But we also have as an independent variable the change in violence between the 2 years right before this election in 2016, so the average of 2014 and 15, and the average of the 2 years at the end of these mandates in 2016, so 2018 and 19. So the second independent variable, the second key independent variable would be this change in violence. So is the municipality becoming more violent over this term, or is it just a violent municipality overall? So basically, these are the two independent variables that we are investigating here. Also, we have a bunch of controls, but just to have the results more clear for our analysis and interpretation, we will focus on these key independent variables. We have here, so starting with the results, first, some exploratory spatial data that is presenting the LISA clusters. These are so the clusters revealing the municipalities that concentrate in these areas and in the surrounding municipalities a higher level of change in vereadoras. So these are municipalities in red where there is a high increase in the number of vereadoras elected, surrounded by municipalities also with an increase in vereadoras or councilwoman elected. And in blue, it's the opposite. So municipalities with a decrease in the number of councilwomen surrounded by other municipalities also with this decrease. So here with this spatial diagnostics, we are analyzing if there is any spatial pattern of cluster revealing that this is a more regional than only an isolated and non-spatial phenomenon. And on the right, we have the same analysis for the black councilwoman, black vereadoras. So apparently, in these first maps, there are very few clusters, and they are all over the country. There is not a very clear pattern except maybe that in the north of the country are very low numbers of clusters. More here in the center west of the country, some clusters, but we will further investigate these results. More interesting at this point would be to see the results of the OLS models. Here we are presenting just two of the models that we run, one very simple with no controls and one with all the controls. On the left, considering the election rates for all women, so white and black women, and on the right, only considering the results for this variation on election rates for black women, so black councilwomen. We see here that the results of the OLS, changing violence has no effect. So changing violence, meaning that the increase of violence in this recent term has no effect on the election rates of women overall, but it reduces, it's associated with a lower election rate of black women to the city councils. Also, and on our point of view, more interestingly, there is an opposite effect on the level of violence. So where the level of violence is higher, there is a lower election of women in general for city councils. But where the level of violence is higher, there is a higher election of black women for city councils. So we are really challenged to try to find explanations to these opposite effects here. We'll go back to it more at the end of our presentation. Also, we have a similar result here for women in general and black women, considering the baseline level of elected women in 2016. So where this baseline is higher, there is a lower variation in the election rates of women and black women in general. So this maybe it's an expected result. If the percent is already higher, the increase in this percent tends to be negative. So tends to be a decrease in this percent of elected women. Okay, so now it's my turn to ask Matt if you prefer me to continue presenting or if you wanna control your own presentation, Matt.
Yeah, I can drive it on this end if you'd like to stop sharing. Or I think if I start sharing, no, it's saying you need to stop.
I finished here.
Oops. Now it's my turn to have technical difficulties. Can everybody see the projected version?
Yes.
Great. So this is where Marcelo left off. Well, first, I just want to reiterate our thanks to Cide and to everybody. I know Marcelo said that already, but I just wanted to thank everybody for having us here. Muchas gracias, and it's good to see lots of friendly faces, familiar faces again. Moving on with the presentation, returning to the images that Marcelo showed earlier about some of the geographic clustering in our outcomes of interest. On the left, you see the change in city councilors and vereadoras and female city councilors all women, right? All female city councilors. And on the right, you see the geographic clustering of the just the Black female councilors. And there are theoretical reasons to anticipate that each individual municipality in Brazil, right? Each of the 5,562 municipalities are not independent, isolated units, right? They exist within micro regions, within states, also within states, within macro regions. There's likely some kind of interaction among them. So for theoretical reasons, we wouldn't expect, each individual municipality to behave as if it were independently distributed in some random universe or population of municipalities. And we also ran some diagnostics to see, or some tests to detect this geographic clustering. These maps here reflect some of that clustering, but we also did some other tests that we're not reporting here, but a Lagrange multiplier test is sort of a classical test of spatial dependence. And it detected no spatial dependence in all female councilors, all vereadoras, the first outcome of interest, but it did detect what is termed spatial error dependence in Black female councilors. And what that suggests is that the process that's shaping the distribution of the change in the election of Black female councilors might be influenced by some larger, some other factor to which multiple municipalities are being exposed to simultaneously. So one other model that we ran is the spatial error model that controls for this process, right? That sets of municipalities might be exposed to some unobserved factor at the same time. Could be at the micro region or at a macro region. And basically what we wanted to convey is that the results are surprisingly robust, right? The results are surprisingly stable. If you look quickly at these results here, this is again just for Black female city councilors. The effect of change in violence is negative and statistically significant. The effect of level of violence is positive and statistically significant. And I'll just scroll back quickly to look at the results from Marcelo, and you can see there that change in violence, we're looking at the column on the far right, the fourth column. The effect of change in violence is negative. The effect of level of violence is positive. I'll scroll back to where we were just to see that the results are surprisingly stable, right? Even when we look at the spatial error model. One other thing that these cluster maps suggest is that the relationships between violence and participation are likely uneven across different municipalities, right? As we move from one municipality to another, it looks like there's different patterns across the country, right? Large amounts, higher levels, higher than average levels of change in vereadoras are appearing in some parts of the country, lower than average are appearing in other parts of the country. This suggests what the spatial literature terms heterogeneity, right? The relationship is uneven or is varying as you move from one municipality to another. And one approach that's very promising these days that accounts for two key concepts in the spatial literature: scale, or the level at which a particular independent variable influences the outcome of interest, and dependence, which we were just testing in this model, are multi-scale geographically weighted regressions. And before we get into the maps here, I just want to say briefly that what this approach allows us to do is to estimate a coefficient for each of our key independent variables at each one of the municipalities, right? So rather than having a single coefficient, as we were just looking at in the regressions, rather than having a single beta, right, or a single coefficient for all of Brazil, we have a coefficient for each of the 5,562 municipalities, right? So we have 5,562 coefficients. Plus the approach estimates that coefficient at varying geographic scales. So for some variables, it calculates that the effect is actually fairly local, right? It might be operating at the level of a micro region. And for other variables, it might be operating at a more global level, right? Across the entire country, across all 5,000 municipalities. So with that in mind, let's take a closer look at these graphs, and we see generally the same result that we saw before, right? I just want to highlight that the top row of graphs is change in violence, the effect of change in violence. The bottom row of graphs is the effect of the level of violence. And the column on the right, the first column, sorry, on the left, the first column is all women, and the column on the right, my hands are doing the opposite thing, right? For you, the column on the right is Black women, right? Black female counselors, city councilors. And if you remember the results from the OLS regressions, the effect of change on violence for all women, which would be the top left graph, was not statistically significant, but the relationship was positive. And here what we see is that we're looking at this graph here, right? Here we see that the relationship is positive. Wherever you see a blank area, it's not statistically significant. Wherever you see red, it's positive. Wherever you see blue, it's negative. So recalling the OLS regressions, the effect of change in violence was positive, but not statistically significant. Here, as we look at the more local level, we see that the relationship is positive. It's not statistically significant in some parts of Brazil, in some municipalities, but it is statistically significant in other parts of Brazil. Here, if we look at this side, the graph to the right here, if we remember the OLS regressions, the effect of the change in violence was negative and statistically significant. Here we see that it is negative and statistically significant, but only in certain municipalities, not across all of Brazil. It's a little more focused. However, if you look up at these numbers, this is where the scale of the relationship is. And the effect is fairly global, right? So this is a change in violence is operating at a very large scale in Brazil. Dampening the election of Black female councilors, right? Whereas change in violence is driving, right, the election of all women. If we look at the bottom row of drawings, on the bottom left, this drawing, we see that the level of violence has a negative effect on the election of all women. So it has that dampening effect that we saw in the OLS regressions. Not in all municipalities. It's not statistically significant in all municipalities, but it does have a very large scale. While level of violence has a more local effect, a smaller scale, and drives, right, impulses the election of Black female city councilors. So we're seeing essentially the same inverse relationship that we saw in the OLS regressions. If we recall that the basic symmetry or asymmetry of those results from the OLS regressions, we're seeing that here, but in much finer detail, right? Where the effects for each municipality. If we move forward, these are things that we could come back to later if folks want to during the question and answer session. One of the things that we're very interested in doing is pairing this analysis with some qualitative work, maybe some interviews. And what you're seeing here is the residuals of that multi-scale geographically weighted regression on the left. That's a map of the residuals on the top left and the bottom left. For top left is all women, bottom left is Black women. And basically where you see very small, red is again a very high positive residual, blue is a large negative residual. Ideally, something we might want to choose, right, is a municipality with a small residual where theoretically our model is working fairly well, and go do some interviews there to try to explain what's happening. And for instance, one promising region could be these southeastern states in Brazil for the analysis of Black female counselors. Those look like very small residuals, and you can see that here in the cluster analysis, right? There's a large cluster of very small residuals in those southeastern states. But as Marcelo mentioned, well, I think we can conclude here, but we have some preliminary results also for candidates. I might stop here and just maybe see if folks want to talk about that in the question and answer session. But we had some, I'm just trying to move the bar here because I can't read my own slide the way Zoom set things up here. We have some preliminary results because we were thinking, well, maybe the relationship isn't so much between violence and the election of women. Maybe it's the relationship of interest. Maybe we should be more interested in the relationship between violence and whether women identify themselves as a candidate for office, right? So how many women are running for office, not how many get elected to office. I think both questions, I think all three of us agree that both questions are interesting, but we do have some preliminary results, a similar research design for candidates if folks are interested in that. At this point though, based on what we've done so far, there is a relationship, there appears to be a relationship between femicides, or the murders of women, and women's political participation. There is a different dynamic going on for all women than for Black women, right? And we summarize here this asymmetry that we find in the results, both in the OLS regressions, in the spatial error models, and in these multi-scale geographically weighted regressions. These relationships, the asymmetry of these relationships is remarkably stable. The effect of change in violence has a particular relationship on all women being elected to city councilors, but has a inverse relationship on Black women, and the level of violence has one effect for all women and then a different effect for Black women. And I think I'll stop there unless Marcelo or Aline want to wrap up with anything and turn to questions.
I just wanted to, add and maybe also invite comments and questions on this end. It's really challenging for us how to explain these results. Matt mentioned that we want to do some interviews. This could be a way to try to investigate, but very preliminarily, what we think is that a possible hypothesis is that female in general, or women in general, benefit from there are some institutional rules in Brazil that promote women candidates for different political positions, and also maybe women in general benefit from a higher media exposition, public exposition when they suffer from violence. So this could be a way that we could maybe explain how the electorate would answer more or faster when there is an increase in violence against women in general. However, the same does not occur for Black women. So there is no institutional rule to protect the candidacy or Black women candidates for different political roles. And so maybe the election of these women depends on an already high pattern of violence against these women that motivates a behavior that is more similar to a social movement explanation of critical mass. So Black women have to suffer for a long time to organize, mobilize, and get their candidates known by the society so that they can be elected. But these, as I mentioned, are just preliminary investigations so far. I don't know if Aline also wants to add something, or we can go to questions.
It's actually also a question because it's really a new relationship between the both phenomena. And I mean, I research gender violence and intersectionality, and even for me was difficult to how to interpret the results. And of course we have hypotheses and you have the literature to help, but it would be really useful to listen other researchers and to see if you have um, questions or thoughts or something that can really help us to advance for the second level of the research. And also, I would like to say thank you again to be here and to really listen to us and help us with this research. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, Aline, and Matthew. Applauses, virtual applauses, and the other icons in the Zoom environment. Well, people, if somebody wants to make any comment, please just raise your hand or use the chat. Also, for other people in YouTube or in Instagram, you may also post your questions if there's anybody there. I do have some. I mean, it was very interesting to see the results to some extent. I was also, I guess you were the same, a little bit, let's say, I mean, it opens more questions, right? When you see that levels and change in these variables affect in a different way to some extent. So first of all, I think this is very interesting. I do definitely think this is an opportunity to get into the data in a different, with a different approach. Maybe the qualitative approach will be very nice to understand what is driving the results. And this is just a comment. Obviously, I did not read the paper and I'm not the official commentator here. There is no official commentator. So everybody can make any questions or any alternative hypothesis. I was thinking about your, I guess this is the Femicides. That's your dependent or independent variable. I wasn't sure about that.
Independent.
The independent. Okay. Yes, Daniel says the left hand side. Nice. So is there any data about Femicides, whether we could know before if this is something that affects equally white women or Black women, and if these differences could also help us understand a little bit better the the results? That's one of my first questions. Maybe this is something that you have already looked at, and we can already discard this, I guess, hypothesis, or look at this presumption. Then on the other hand, I see that these other variables, levels of violence and change in violence. Why would you take these two variables? Like, what is the advantage between one and the other, and what were you expecting to see with these two different strategies? And my question is a little bit with regards to, so I can understand change. That is, for example, big change means that you had certain level of violence, and then this change very much, right? But when you talk about levels, for example, I think about high levels being as a baseline, and then having a little bit more level of violence, not necessarily is a huge change. It is only something that it has been there already, and maybe what you're capturing there is a tendency, right? Instead of a change that really happened. I mean, something that was very meaningful for this locality. So I would like to also try to understand why the use of these two variables. And those are my two questions, with the only purpose of trying to understand a little bit more the results, which I think are very wide opening, and also very interesting in terms of more questions being posed on the table. We have also Daniel who raised his hand, and maybe we can collect another question. Edgar also wanted to make a question, and then we can wrap up. I mean, finish these three questions, and then we'll go to the authors. So Daniel, please, and then Edgar.
No, thank you very much. First of all, let me commend you for a fascinating research paper and study. So I have three comments with several questions in them. So first, I want to going to go directly to the point so that everyone has enough time to tell you their feedback. So the first thing that I would encourage you to do a little bit further is to connect the theoretical expectations with the data analysis ex ante. So right now, I was left a little bit uncertain of what were the empirical implications of theory that could be tested with this data. And for example, you have social dominance theories, Iranian's stuff, which is very interesting. You also have I've worked on lynchings and this kind of stuff, so I know a little bit about Sears and Hovland and social hierarchy theory. But you also have, like, when you're dealing with gender stuff, you also have like Kira-san Bonmatsu and the people that study like voting for women, and mainly what they find is that people, like, the electorate is not biased against women, and like most of the traction in this bias against women is conducted by elite behavior and party behavior, putting women outside of the ballots. So, and I think each of these different theories have different expectations of what you would expect to see in the electorate. And it would be very nice to have like expectations and ex ante, and then have clear hypotheses that we can connect to these theories. So far, I was a little bit like confused. Then it would be very interesting for you to look at other kind of data. So far, I feel that there is a mismatch between the outcomes and the theoretical expectations and conclusions. You talk about women political participation, and that's normally measured by turnout. So I was expecting to look at turnout. I suspect that you have quite good turnout data, You might even be able to reach like electoral precincts, and in Mexico you can even get at the casilla, at the polling at the casilla level, and I suspect that there is racial clustering in Brazil, so you can probably make some inferences of what casillas or electoral sections are more black or white than others, or have more women and men than others. And that would be very interesting. And you can kind of play with this turnout data if you want to make an argument for turning out mechanisms. And then finally, I had some questions about the empirics. So when I was looking at these maps and these 5,000 different coefficients, I was thinking about, well, where is the variance coming from, right? So you have like two different time periods. Are we looking at one single municipality with two data points? And that's where the traction, like the temporal variance is coming from, and the changes. So it was a little, once you start controlling and estimating so many coefficients, I no longer know where the variance is coming from, and it would be very nice to think a little bit more about this. Secondly, what are the controls, right? You have cross-sectional controls, but then you have temporal variance, and as far as I know, in 2016 you had Gilma. Well, Gilma was put out of office in August, I think, or something like that. And then in 2020, you have Bolsonaro, and that's a really radical change, right? Gilma, a woman president, and Bolsonaro in 2020, right? So you would expect to see quite a lot of change in the number of women participating. And I think there might be a story there that you might want to control for in terms of politics and where the parties are operating. And I was a little bit left in blank. I know there is a lot of things going on in your paper. I probably didn't have enough time to explain all the controls that you included, but I was just like left wondering about that. And then I also had this issue of post-treatment bias, right? You have two different time periods, and I was left wondering again whether changes in violence at time one can cause differences in key mechanisms at time two that when you control for them can have some effect in the changes that you're estimating. So I would just be a little bit careful when you have this type of cross-sectional time varying models to explain a little bit more about the controls that you're including, and just contemplate the possibility of these post-treatment bias that I don't know about the controls. And finally, I was wondering about the measurement of feminicides. Are you using an absolute or a relative measure of feminicides? That is, are you just looking at how many women are murdered in absolute terms, or with respect to how many women and men in total, like the proportion of murders that are women, which would be another potential measurement of violence against women, right? You might have just places in which people die a lot, I imagine in the favelas, and just even if people are just shooting each other at random, you would expect a lot of women to die, and other places in which you have very few homicides, but everyone being killed are women, right? And those are two different types of municipalities, and this could have an impact on women participation. But I think you have a very interesting subject. I think it's very important in Mexico also, although we don't have this issue of intersectionality. Well, maybe with indigenous women or things like that, we're just in the blank. I don't think we have done so much sophisticated work as you are presenting right here. I just want to congratulate you. That's everything I can think of in terms of feedback, and thank you so much for presenting this fascinating topic in our seminar.
Edgar, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I agree that this is a very interesting research. And my comments are related to some of Daniel's regarding adding more data. I was thinking about, like, for example, the percentage of participation of women in elections, the kind of territory, the culture of that territory. You know, Brazil is one of the biggest countries. So I guess that there are many cultural difference. I don't know, I'm just guessing between the South and the North, or the West and the East. And probably these make a difference in that representation that you are looking for. Another thing, if the territories are urban or rural, I think that this could add some valuable information to your research. That's all my comment. Thank you.
Okay, so we can close this round of questions and allow the authors to comment.
So I can start, but definitely I think Aline and Matt can have better answers than I do for some of these questions. But thank you, first of all, for these comments and questions. I think this is already extremely helpful to make us think about the research. As I try to mention during the presentation, we did a lot of tests before presenting these current results to you. So we are following a very inductive reasoning here to identify any possible relationship between violence and political participation. So starting with Danielle's comments, I think you're absolutely right that we have to anchor this analysis more strongly on theory and in our expectations. But to be true, in the beginning, so far, we did not find a lot making this relationship between violence and political participation, and also considering intersectionality. We see that these are three topics that are becoming increasingly important, and I know it's not something that I would that I feel that I know enough, but I know that that there is a lot of very good research being doing in analyzing women's political participation, violence, and intersectionality. We're just trying to make a contribution here, putting these pieces together. But I think we have to develop more these expectations. I will skip some of the questions, but just to answer some of these points, we are using rates for violence. So we are considering feminicide as rates of the population. I think it's an important issue that Danielle raised on considering the potential bias that something that occurred in 2016 might have on the results. We'll have to think a little bit on how to protect ourselves from these potential bias. But I think that my personal bet here, I think that the really needed next step is to develop some qualitative research trying to make sense of these results. I would prefer, we could do several things still and simultaneously considering the time constraints. But the thing is, better than trying to make an identification strategy that is the most robust. I think there's a lot going on, and as Matthew pointed out, there's a lot of heterogeneity here on these effects across the country. So it would be better to try to explore some of these with some of the cases. So on Oliver's questions, I think we have these two key independent variables: the level of violence and the change in violence, as one of these attempts to not rely entirely on one single measure of violence here, because we do know that these numbers are, they could, there could be something in one particular year that could affect this. So maybe we're considering these two measures of violence as a way to kind of make sense more broadly of this phenomenon. And also, Edgar, I think you're right. I don't recall all of the controls that we included here, but we do have a lot. I remember that we have some interesting results regarding inequality. As you know, inequality it's a big issue in Brazil. We are one of the most unequal countries in the world, and certainly in Latin America. And inequality has some relationship with political participation. We do have data for rural population. I'm not sure if we included that. We could include that and run the stats if we did not do that so far. But yeah, that's it. I think I would like to hear from Matt and Aline, but thank you a lot for your comments and questions.
I think I'll jump on it. I just want to add a comment about how we are considering femicides and which rate we are considering that. I think it's important to say that femicide is a crime in Brazilian penal code. So normally we really have the municipalities having to they have to classify the crime when they are motivated by gender. But this is a problem in Brazil because you really have some blank data from some municipalities, and sometimes we really don't have the correct classification by the municipalities. But we have some proxies that is used, like the semi-proxies who are national-wide used, so you can really look for them to have to normalize what we consider by femicide and official data about that. So you really don't have to go municipality by municipality to consider what could be a femicide or not. But this is really a question, and it's also important. We are like we just mentioned Bolsonaro, and we have a political crisis, but we also have another crisis in Brazil. And right now we did not have the census last year, so you really have data issues, official data issue in Brazil, because you don't have the census, so you don't really have the official data so actualized that how we normally have in Brazil. So we are really having problems with that, but we are using numbers that most of the think tanks and universities and even like the governments are using to look for the phenomenon. So this is a thing. The second thing I wanted to add, I think is really, okay.
Sorry, Aline, just one question. So are you calculating the number of women murdered? over the total population of the municipality? Because another thing, no, is the total number of women on, and under you have the total number of homicides in total, or just the, okay.
Yeah, and
Okay.
and for Black women,
it.
it's Black women homicides and Black women in the population.
Women in the population, not total
Black
homicides.
For total, for women in general, it's women homicides and women in the population, and for Black women, it's Black women homicides and Black women in the population.
Okay. Because you could, what I was saying, like you wouldn't have these problems of the census if you just use like the proportion of homicides that are of women and the proportion of homicides that are of Black women, for example.
Yeah. I see. We have a projection of the number of population right now. It's not that we don't have data. We have, because like the official government, the official statistic institution is still working, doing projections, and they have research each year. But it's just to say that we believe that we will have more accurate data when you have the census, but we still doing research, and all the Brazilians are doing the same, because we have this official data who is still doing projections, just because you don't have the picture, like the big picture as we normally have in Brazil. The second thing I wanna add is about theoretical expectation, and I really think there is something that we have to work on that. And I always really think about intersectionality and political violence, but I really think this research is not only about that. It's also only how you can look for these as part of the same phenomenon of violence. So if you look for private violence and public violence, we're seeing the same phenomenon. And it's really important to understand why we have more Black representation. We are only studying Black women, but if you look to Brazil right now, we have the first election of trans women in Brazil after Bolsonaro election. So it's really, you are seeing that people are organized themselves to have more political representations, because they are feeling like that violence is increasing. So it's really, we still have to look for that. And I think maybe if you do qualitative research and really listen to the people and consider this experience of the people who are organizing this themselves and with political representative, you can have a better sense of that. And maybe it would be useful first listen, and really, of course, we have to do the previous theoretical research to build these forms and to build the interviews and everything. But I think maybe it's better to have more data and then look again to the theoretical frameworks, and to see what we can use and what you can learn for other research to better look for these results. So it's just to say that I agree with you. I think you have to go further to really better align these expectations between empirical research and the theoretical research.
I really want to say thank you for these comments. These are really helpful. I, as Marcelo said, and as Aline just said, I have a lot of confidence in doing qualitative work to follow up on this, but I also think we need to fine tune the quantitative work. I'm a strong proponent of mixed methods work, and I like the sequence of going from quantitative models to fleshing out the dynamics of the quantitative model in qualitative research. So I think we've got some work ahead of us in the quantitative portion first. Turning to one of that had to do with one of Oliver's comments. With regards to Danielle, I want to thank you for the suggestion for turnout, the turnout measure. I think one of our, we were initially focused on elected female counselors, right, and elected Black female counselors, and then we stepped back and we're like, okay, well, we should be looking at candidates. And you're saying, well, step back further, right, and look at the voters, right, sort of turnout among women. So thank you. That's a great suggestion. Also, thank you for the measure about the percent of all homicides that are female. We were trying to keep the base population related to the people being killed, right? So if it's all women, if it's homicides of women, then the base population is the female population. If it's homicides of Black women, then the base population is the Black female population. But that's another nice measure, right? Maybe to see if the results are stable across the percent of all homicides that are female. You also asked, where's this variance coming from in these locally weighted regressions? And basically it's a moving window. And so for each municipality, there's a sequential process that estimates how many observations are optimal, right, for that particular variable. But in every estimation of every one of our coefficients, there's hundreds of observations involved, right? So if there's 5,000 municipalities in Brazil, then even if it's just using 10% of those municipalities, right, the 10% closest municipalities and weighting the closest ones, the data from the closest ones heavier than the data from the farther ones away, we're still talking about 550 municipalities, right? Information from 550 units being used to estimate the coefficient for that focal unit. I hope that helps clarify. Then with regards to Edgar's comment about regional culture, one of the values of this locally weighted approach is that it is moving around, right, and generating a separate estimation across different regions of Brazil. So it's altering the estimation based on local factors. However, the natural next question, right, to ask from these locally weighted regressions is why is the coefficient different in municipality A versus municipality B? Let's say in the northern Amazon region of Brazil, it might be, the coefficient might be 10, and in the southeastern part, maybe near Sao Paulo, it might be 5. Why, or negative 10? Why is that coefficient different? And so the geographically weighted regression kind of asks you to go and do work, right, and identify perhaps what unobserved omitted variable might be conditioning the effect of a variable that you already have in the model, right? It might be local culture, right? We might find that it is local culture, but the method itself is asking you to think about what omitted unobserved variable might be conditioning the relationship. So again, that takes us back to the mixed methods approach, and I think that's eventually the path to take. But your comments will definitely help us fine tune and improve the quantitative analysis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marcelo, Aline, and Matthew. We do have some more questions, but I think it's already a little bit late, and the seminar has extended a little bit more, and so I would like to wrap it up here, and basically, if we can also send you some of the other questions, basically questions, if you think they are useful for you, that would be good for us. Thank you very much, Marcelo, Aline, and Matthew. Thank you very much for coming to our international seminar and presenting your project, your research, which I think is in a working stage. It is a very promising work, and also I'm also very up to the mixed methods approach. So I will definitely be looking forward if there's any continuation in terms of interviews or other types of approaches. I'll also thank the people who made questions and comments. This seminar would not be the same if people don't raise their hand and comment something about the researchers. I think they can leave here with some of the insights that we have already placed over the table. So thank you very much. And to all of the Iceberg Project fellows and researchers, I thank you very much for being with us, and we'll be looking forward to the next seminars. Thank you very much, Marcelo, Aline, and Matthew.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
Everybody stay
Bye-bye.
safe. Listo, Leo. Muchas gracias.
Listo, prof. Pues ya, se quedan los videos en YouTube, en
Está todavía
Facebook.
live, todavía está live.
Un segundo.
Pero tiene ahí el... Ahí está.
Se quedan los videos en YouTube, en Facebook. Mm.